The last rays of the sunset painted the Dakota Territory sky in hues of amber and crimson. As the stagecoach rumbled into Evanston, South Dakota, trailing dust and broken promises behind its weathered wheels, Francesca Thornton clutched her travel-worn valise with trembling fingers, her fever-bright eyes struggling to focus on the small frontier town that was to be her new home. She had crossed an ocean and a continent to marry a man she'd never met, only to arrive at her destination barely able to stand. The year was 1876, and like many women before her, Francesca had answered an advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper. After exchanging letters for 6 months with Xavier Whittaker, a cattle rancher outside of Evanston, she had sold everything she owned in England to purchase passage to America. The journey had been arduous, and somewhere between New York and the Dakota Territory, she had fallen ill. "Last stop, Evanston," the stagecoach driver called out, his voice barely registering through Francesca's fever-addled mind. She gathered what little strength remained in her body and attempted to stand, only to collapse back onto the wooden bench seat. The other passengers had disembarked at earlier stops, leaving her alone in the coach. "Miss, you all right in there?" The driver peered through the open door, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw her condition. "You look mighty peaky." "I'm fine," Francesca managed, her English accent thick despite her best efforts. "Just tired from the journey. Is there someone waiting for me?" "Xavier Whittaker," the driver nodded. "Zav's been coming to town every day for a week, waiting on your coach. He's over at the general store right now. Shall I fetch him for you, please?" she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed as another wave of dizziness washed over her. Xavier Whittaker stood at the counter of Evanston's only general store, examining a bolt of blue cotton fabric. He decided his cabin needed proper curtains before his bride arrived. After living alone for 5 years since establishing his ranch, he'd spent the last month in a frenzy of cleaning and preparing, determined that Francesca would find her new home comfortable, if modest. At 32, Xavier had built his cattle ranch from nothing, working himself to exhaustion for years. But the isolation had finally gotten to him. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and town was a half-day's ride. When his sister in Boston had suggested he advertise for a mail-order bride, he'd initially dismissed the idea, but loneliness had eventually worn down his resistance. "Zav, she's here." The stagecoach driver burst through the door, interrupting Xavier's thoughts. "Your English gal's arrived, but she's in a bad way. Burning with fever, she is." Xavier's heart plummeted. He abandoned the fabric and rushed out of the store, his long strides carrying him swiftly to the stagecoach. When he pulled open the door, he wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted him. The woman from the daguerreotype she'd sent him was barely recognizable in the pale, sweating figure slumped against the coach window. Her chestnut hair, which had been neatly arranged in the photograph, hung in damp tendrils around a face flushed with fever. "Francesca," he said softly, climbing into the coach, her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage. Despite her condition, she attempted a smile. "Xavier Whittaker, I presume?" Her voice was barely audible, her English accent pronounced. "I apologize for not being more presentable." "Don't you worry about that now," he said, his throat tight with concern. He touched her forehead gently and jerked his hand away at the heat radiating from her skin. "You're burning up. It's just a touch of something I picked up on the journey," she murmured, trying to sit up straighter. "I'm sure after a good night's rest." Her words cut off as she slumped forward, unconscious. Xavier caught her before she could fall, alarm surging through him. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt. She couldn't have weighed more than a new calf. Doc Watson still in town? Xavier asked the driver urgently. Left yesterday for a berthing out at the Johnson place. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest. Xavier cursed under his breath. Get her trunk loaded onto my wagon. I'm taking her home. The 15-mile journey to Xavier's ranch was agonizing. He'd made a pallet in the back of the wagon where Francesca lay unconscious, wrapped in blankets despite the warm June evening. He stopped twice to give her water, which she swallowed reflexively before slipping back into unconsciousness. By the time they reached his ranch, night had fallen. The two-story cabin he'd built with his own hands stood silhouetted against the starry sky. It was larger than most bachelor ranchers' homes, as he'd always planned for a family someday. Now, carrying his unconscious bride to be across the threshold, he felt a twisted sense of irony. Xavier laid Francesca on his bed and lit the oil lamp beside it, illuminating her fever-flushed face. Up close, he could see how lovely she was, despite her illness-high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips currently parched from dehydration. He retrieved a basin of cool water and a cloth, then gently began bathing her face and neck. "You'll be all right," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. "I'll take care of you." As the night progressed, Francesca's condition worsened. Her breathing grew labored and she tossed restlessly, occasionally mumbling incoherent words. Xavier had seen fevers before living on the frontier, meant dealing with all manner of illnesses without a doctor's help, but the intensity of Francesca's illness frightened him. He remembered his mother's remedies from his childhood in Pennsylvania. She had believed in the healing properties of willow bark tea for fever, so he brewed some, adding honey to mask the bitterness. When it was ready, he carefully propped Francesca up against his chest. "You need to drink this," he said close to her ear. "It'll help bring down the fever." Her eyelids fluttered. "So thirsty," she whispered. "I know. This will help. Small sips now." He held the cup to her lips, and she obediently swallowed a little of the tea before turning her head away. "Bitter," she mumbled. "I know, but it'll help you feel better, just a little more." She managed a few more sips before exhaustion overtook her again. Xavier laid her back down, replaced the cool cloth on her forehead, and settled into a chair beside the bed. It was going to be a long night. As dawn broke on the eastern horizon, Xavier was still awake. He'd spent the night alternating between bathing Francesca's face and neck with cool water and trying to get more willow bark tea into her. Her fever had spiked dangerously around midnight, and for a terrifying hour, he'd thought he might lose her before he'd even had a chance to know her. Now, as early morning light filtered through the window, he noted with relief that her breathing seemed less labored, though her skin was still unnaturally hot to the touch. He took advantage of her continued unconsciousness to feed and water his livestock quickly, rushing through chores that normally took hours. When he returned to the cabin, he found Francesca's eyes open, though glazed with fever. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. Xavier hurried to her side, relief washing over him. "You're at my ranch about 15 miles outside of Evanston. I'm Xavier Whittaker." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Your letters. I remember your handwriting, so precise." Her gaze wandered around the room, taking in the rustic but clean furnishings. "Is this our home?" The simple question caught Xavier off guard. Our home. There was something both terrifying and wonderful about those words. "Yes," he said. "Though I understand if you want to reconsider our arrangement once you're well." She closed her eyes. "You must be disappointed. This isn't how I planned to arrive." "Hush now. No one plans to get sick. Save your strength." He held a cup of water to her lips. Small sips. She obeyed, then sank back against the pillows. "Thank you," she whispered before drifting back to sleep. The second night was worse than the first. Francesca's fever spiked again, and she became delirious, calling out names Xavier didn't recognize and occasionally sobbing. He held her hand through the worst of it, speaking soothingly even when he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I lost them," she cried at one point, clutching his hand with surprising strength. "I lost them all." "Who did you lose?" Xavier asked gently. "Mother, father, Thomas." "The influenza took them. I was the only one who lived." Her eyes, bright with fever, fixed on his face. "Are you death come for me at last?" Xavier's heart clenched. "No, Francesca, I'm Xavier, remember? I'm here to help you live, not to take you away." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Xavier," she repeated, as though committing his name to memory. "Your letters, they were kind. You seemed real." "I am real," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "And so are you. You're going to get through this." By the time dawn broke on the second morning, Xavier was exhausted, having slept only in short snatches. He'd moved his chair beside the bed and found himself dozing with his head resting on the mattress near Francesca's arm. He awakened to the sensation of fingers gently touching his hair. He lifted his head to find Francesca watching him, her eyes clearer than they had been since her arrival. "You stayed," she said softly. Xavier straightened, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Of course I stayed. Your hair." "It's the color of autumn wheat," she observed, her voice still weak but more coherent. "Your photograph didn't show that." Xavier felt an unexpected warmth rise to his cheeks at her observation. The daguerreotype artist said it would take too long to sit for a colored portrait. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Pity, it's a nice color." He felt her forehead, relieved to find it somewhat cooler. "Your fever's coming down. Thanks to your care, I imagine." She attempted to sit up, but weakness forced her back against the pillows. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. This is the morning of the third day since you arrived." She closed her eyes briefly. 3 days of your life wasted tending to a half-dead Englishwoman. Not what you signed up for, I'm afraid. Xavier shook his head. "Nothing about you is a waste, Francesca." Her eyes, those remarkable sage-green eyes, opened and studied him with newfound clarity. "You're very kind, Xavier Whittaker. Your letters suggested as much, but I wasn't certain if the man would match the correspondence." "I'm just a simple rancher," he said. "What you see is what you get." "What I see," she said softly, "is a man who's barely slept for days while caring for a stranger he only knew through letters." Xavier felt suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. "You should try to eat something. I've got some broth simmering." As he moved to stand, she caught his wrist with a weak hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not sending me to a doctor or leaving me in town." "We made a commitment to each other," he said simply. "I intend to honor that if you still wish to." "I do," she whispered, "if you'll still have me." The third night, Xavier insisted on sleeping in the chair beside the bed, despite Francesca's protests that she was feeling better and he should rest properly in the spare room. "I'll sleep when you're fully recovered," he insisted, though his body ached with exhaustion. "At least share the bed," Francesca suggested, then blushed furiously when she realized the implications of her words. "I don't mean," Xavier smiled, the first genuine smile since her arrival. "I know what you meant, but it wouldn't be proper. We're to be married," she pointed out. "And you look ready to collapse. The bed is large enough for both of us without impropriety." After a brief internal struggle between propriety and practicality, Xavier relented. He lay on top of the quilt while Francesca remained underneath it, a respectable distance between them. Despite his exhaustion, he found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. "Tell me about your ranch," she said softly in the darkness. Xavier stared at the ceiling, gathering his thoughts. "I have about 100 head of cattle, mostly Herefords. Good stock." The ranch is 640 acres, a full section of land. Most of it's grazing land, but there's a creek running through the western portion that never runs dry, even in drought years. The soil's fertile enough in the bottomlands for a decent garden. It sounds lovely, she murmured. In your letters, you mentioned wanting to plant an orchard. He was surprised she remembered such a detail. Yes, apple trees, maybe some cherry. It'll take years before they bear fruit, but... He trailed off, suddenly aware that he was talking about a future that assumed her presence. I've always wanted an orchard, she said, her voice growing sleepy. My grandmother had one in Hertfordshire. I used to spend summers there as a child. Tell me about England, Xavier requested, partly because he was genuinely curious and partly to keep her talking, to reassure himself that she was truly on the mend. Francesca spoke softly about green hills and ancient stone walls, about misty mornings and afternoon teas. Her voice grew fainter as sleep began to claim her, but she managed to ask, "And you? Where did you grow up?" "Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. My father was a blacksmith, taught me the trade which comes in handy out here. My mother was a school teacher before she married." Are they still living? Xavier was silent for a moment. No, they died in '65 just as the war was ending, typhoid. In the darkness he felt Francesca's hand find his on top of the quilt. "I'm sorry," she said. "Loss is difficult." "It is," he agreed, turning his hand to squeeze hers gently. "Get some rest now." He listened as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened into sleep. Only then did he allow his own exhaustion to overtake him. Xavier awakened to sunlight streaming through the window and the unfamiliar sensation of warmth pressed against his side. During the night, Francesca had curled toward him, her head now resting against his shoulder. For a moment he remained perfectly still, uncertain what to do. Then her eyes fluttered open, and she realized their position with a small gasp, pulling away quickly. "I'm so sorry," she said, mortification coloring her cheeks. "I didn't mean to, it's all right," Xavier assured her, sitting up. He touched her forehead gently. "Your fever's broken completely." Relief washed over her face, followed by determination. "Then I should get up. I've been a burden long enough." "You're still weak," Xavier protested. "You need to rest." Francesca shook her head. "I've been in this bed for 3 days. I need to move about to begin learning my new home." She pushed herself to a sitting position, swaying slightly. "Though perhaps I'll start slowly." Xavier couldn't help but admire her determination. "Let me help you to the table at least. I'll make us some breakfast and you can direct me in bringing in your trunk. I left it on the porch when we arrived." With Xavier's support, Francesca made her way to the kitchen table. She was alarmingly unsteady, but her color was better, and there was a spark of life in her eyes that had been missing before. While Xavier prepared a simple breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, Francesca took in her surroundings with interest. The cabin was larger than she had expected, with the main floor divided into a kitchen, dining area, and sitting room with a stone fireplace. A narrow staircase led to what she presumed were additional rooms upstairs. "Your home is lovely," she said. "Did you build it yourself?" Xavier nodded, setting a plate before her. "Took me 2 years. Started with just the main room and kept adding on. The upstairs has 2 bedrooms and space for more, if needed." The implication hung in the air between them: space for children, for the family they had discussed in their letters. Francesca dropped her gaze to her plate, suddenly shy. "Eat what you can," Xavier said, changing the subject. "You need to regain your strength." She managed half the flapjack and most of her coffee before fatigue began to set in again. Xavier insisted she return to bed, promising to bring in her trunk so she could have her own belongings around her. When he carried the trunk into the bedroom, Francesca was sitting up against the pillows, looking determined despite her obvious exhaustion. "I should change into my own nightgown at least," she said. "I feel peculiar knowing you've seen me in this state." Xavier realized with a jolt that she was wearing one of his shirts as a nightgown, something he'd done without thinking when her fever had soaked her traveling clothes with sweat. I apologize for the impropriety," he stammered. "You were burning up and your dress was—" She held up a hand, stopping his explanation. "You did what was necessary. I'm grateful, truly. Now that I'm awake and aware, I'd prefer my own clothing." "Of course," he said, relieved she wasn't offended. "I'll leave you to change. Call if you need anything." Over the next few days, Francesca's strength gradually returned. She insisted on getting out of bed for longer periods each day, first sitting in a chair by the window, then moving around the cabin with Xavier's support, and finally venturing onto the front porch to breathe the fresh Dakota air. Xavier watched her recovery with a mixture of relief and growing admiration. She never complained, despite the lingering weakness from her illness. Instead, she seemed determined to learn everything about her new home, asking questions about the ranch operations and listening attentively to his explanations. On the 6th day after her arrival, Xavier found her in the kitchen, attempting to prepare supper. She looked up at his entrance, a determined set to her jaw despite the way she leaned heavily on the table for support. "You should be resting," he said, moving to take the knife from her hand. She held it away from him. "I've rested enough. You've been doing everything, tending the cattle, cooking, cleaning, caring for me. It's time I contributed. You nearly died, Francesca. But I didn't, thanks to you. Now I need to start living." She met his gaze steadily. "We made an agreement, you and I. You wanted a wife, not an invalid to nurse." Xavier stared at her, suddenly struck by the courage it must have taken for her to travel across an ocean to marry a man she'd never met. "I wanted you," he said quietly, "whatever that entails." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "Then let me be what you need. Let me be useful," he nodded slowly. "All right, but we'll work together." That evening, they prepared supper side by side, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease, as if they'd been doing it for years instead of hours. Xavier found himself watching Francesca when she wasn't looking the graceful way she moved despite her lingering weakness, the serious concentration on her face as she sliced vegetables, the small smile that curved her lips when she caught him staring. As they sat down to eat, Xavier realized with a start that this was their first meal together where she was truly present and aware. It felt significant somehow, like the true beginning of something. "I've been thinking," he said as they ate, "about our wedding." Francesca looked up, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Yes, we should wait until you're fully recovered," he said. "Give you time to be sure this is what you want." She set her fork down carefully. "Do you doubt my commitment?" "No," he said quickly. "But you've been through a traumatic experience. You haven't even seen much of the ranch yet, or met any of the neighbors. I want to give you time to adjust before we make things official." Francesca was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "That's very thoughtful of you, Xavier. But I made my decision long before I boarded that ship in Southampton. I wouldn't have come if I wasn't certain. Even so, there's no rush. The circuit preacher won't be through for another 2 weeks anyway." She nodded slowly. "Very well. 2 weeks. But I warn you, Mr. Whitaker, I'm not easily dissuaded once I've set my mind to something." Xavier couldn't help but smile. "I'm beginning to realize that, Miss Thornton." The following days established a new rhythm to life at the Whitaker Ranch. Each morning, Xavier rose early to tend to the livestock while Francesca prepared breakfast. Her strength increased daily, though she still tired easily. By the end of the first week of her recovery, She was able to walk the short distance to the garden without assistance, harvesting vegetables for their meals. They spent their evenings on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the endless Dakota sky while sharing stories of their lives before their correspondence began. Xavier told her about his years building the ranch, about the brutal winters and scorching summers, about the neighboring ranchers who had become like family in the absence of his own. Francesca spoke of growing up in a modest home in London, where her father had worked as a clerk for a shipping company. She told Xavier about losing her family to influenza 2 years earlier, about working as a governess afterward, about the loneliness that had led her to answer his advertisement. "I had nothing left in England," she admitted one evening as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "No family, few friends. Your letters offered something I hadn't had in a long time, hope." Xavier studied her profile in the fading light. The illness had left her thinner, accentuating the delicate curve of her cheekbones and the graceful line of her neck. Her chestnut hair, now clean and brushed to a shine, was twisted into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She was beautiful, he realized with a jolt, not in the flashy way of saloon girls or the polished manner of Eastern ladies, but in a quiet, enduring way that made his heart beat faster. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. She turned to look at him, a smile warming her green eyes. "So am I." The next morning, Xavier announced that he needed to ride into Evanston for supplies. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I can postpone the trip if you're not feeling up to it." Francesca shook her head. "I'll be fine. I'm much stronger now, and I promise not to overexert myself." She hesitated, then added, "But perhaps you could post a letter for me. I should write to Mrs. Blackwood at the bride agency to let her know I've arrived safely. She'll be worried when she doesn't hear from me." "Of course," Xavier agreed. "I'll be back before sundown." After he'd ridden away, Francesca spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly than she'd been able to during her recovery. The second floor, as Xavier had mentioned, contained 2 bedrooms and an unfinished space that could eventually become additional rooms. The master bedroom, Xavier's room, where she'd spent her illness, was simply but comfortably furnished with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk by the window. The second bedroom was smaller, with a narrow bed and a simple dresser. Francesca's trunk had been moved here, and her few belongings unpacked and arranged neatly. She ran her fingers over the quilt covering the bed, wondering if Xavier had made these preparations before or after her illness. Downstairs, she examined the bookshelves in the sitting room with interest. Xavier owned more books than she would have expected from a frontier rancher, volumes of history and poetry, alongside practical manuals on animal husbandry and farming techniques. On the bottom shelf, she discovered a collection of Shakespeare's works, the spine cracked and worn from frequent reading. By mid-afternoon, Francesca had written her letter, tidied the already neat cabin, and prepared a stew for supper using vegetables from the garden and beef from Xavier's cold storage. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, something she hadn't done since before her family's deaths. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought her to the front porch. Xavier dismounted, leading a horse she didn't recognize, a gentle-looking mare with a white star on her forehead. "Who's this?" Francesca asked, coming down the steps to meet them. Xavier looked almost shy as he led the mare forward. "This is Daisy. She's for you." Francesca stared at him in surprise. "For me," he nodded. "Every rancher's wife needs her own horse. Daisy's gentle but sure-footed. She'll take good care of you while you're learning to ride." Francesca approached slowly, extending her hand to let the mare sniff her. Daisy nickered softly, bumping her velvety nose against Francesca's palm. "She's beautiful," Francesca whispered, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I thought once you're fully recovered, I could teach you to ride," Xavier continued. "You'll need to be comfortable on horseback out here. Distances are too great for walking, and I don't want you to feel isolated on the ranch." Francesca stroked Daisy's neck, blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you, Xavier. This means more to me than I can express." He cleared his throat, seemingly embarrassed by her emotion. "Well, it's practical, that's all. I should get her settled in the barn." As he led Daisy away, Francesca watched him go, a warm feeling expanding in her chest. In her previous life, no one had ever given much thought to her independence or happiness. Yet this man, who had known her for barely a week, had already demonstrated more consideration than anyone else in her memory. That evening after supper, Xavier surprised her again by retrieving a fiddle from a high shelf in the sitting room. "Do you play?" Francesca asked, intrigued by this new revelation. He nodded, looking slightly self-conscious. "My father taught me. I'm not skilled enough for public performances, but it passes the time on winter evenings." "Would you play something now?" she requested, settling into the rocking chair by the fireplace. Xavier hesitated, then tucked the instrument under his chin and began to play. The melody was simple but haunting, a folk tune that seemed to capture both the loneliness and the beauty of the prairie surrounding them. Francesca watched his hands, strong from years of ranch work, handle the instrument with unexpected delicacy. His expression as he played was one she hadn't seen before, a kind of peaceful concentration that softened the weathered lines of his face. When the tune ended, she applauded softly. "That was lovely, Xavier. What's it called?" "The Wanderer's Return," he replied, lowering the fiddle. "My father used to play it. It sounds like coming home," Francesca observed, "like finding where you belong after a long journey." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "Yes," he said finally, "that's exactly what it's about." The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for Francesca's first riding lesson. Xavier had been pleased by her eagerness to learn, though he cautioned that they would take things slowly, mindful of her still recovering strength. Francesca wore her only skirt suitable for riding, a dark blue woolen garment that had seen better days but would serve the purpose. Xavier helped her mount Daisy, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. "Sit up straight but not stiff," he instructed, adjusting her posture gently. "Your body needs to move with the horse." Francesca nodded, trying to follow his directions. The sensation of being so high off the ground was disconcerting at first. But Daisy stood patiently, her ears flicking occasionally but her body calm. Xavier led them around the ranch yard at a walk, showing Francesca how to use the reins and her legs to direct the mare. She was a quick study, and by the end of an hour he allowed her to guide Daisy on her own while he walked alongside. "You're a natural," he commented as they returned to the barn. "Much better than my first time on horseback." Francesca laughed, her cheeks flushed with exertion and pleasure. "I suspect you're being kind, but thank you. It's exhilarating being on horseback. I can see why you love it." Xavier helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. When she looked up at him, his face was closer than she expected, his blue eyes intent on hers. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, but he stepped back, clearing his throat. "You did well today," he said, turning to tend to Daisy. "Tomorrow we'll try a slightly longer ride if you're up to it." Francesca touched her waist where his hands had been, a curious warmth spreading through her body. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. Over the next several days, Francesca's riding lessons continued, each one venturing a bit farther from the ranch house. Xavier showed her the creek that ran through the western part of his property, the fertile bottomlands where he planned to expand the garden, the gentle slopes where he envisioned the future orchard. "The land here is good," he told her as they dismounted by the creek to rest. "Better than most realize. Everyone's chasing gold in the Black Hills, but there's more lasting wealth in the soil itself." Francesca watched him as he spoke, struck by the passion in his voice. "You truly love it here, don't you?" Xavier nodded, looking out over the rolling grassland. "I came west with nothing but a dream and the skills my father taught me. Found work as a ranch hand, saved every penny, and when this land opened for settlement, I staked my claim. Built every structure with my own hands, drove my first herd up from Texas." He looked back at her. "I've put my heart into this place. It's more than just land to me." "I can see that," Francesca said, "and I'm honored that you're willing to share it with me." "That's the thing about a dream," Xavier said quietly. "It loses something when there's no one to share it with." The unspoken tenderness in his words made Francesca's heart beat faster. They had exchanged letters for months before her journey, sharing hopes and plans for a life together. But this was different. This was real, tangible, happening in the golden sunlight of a Dakota afternoon with the creek murmuring beside them. That evening, Xavier announced that some of the neighboring ranchers would be stopping by the next day. "They've been asking about you," he explained. "I've held them off while you were recovering, but they're getting curious about the Englishwoman I've brought home." Francesca felt a flutter of nervousness. "Will they approve, you think, of you bringing a wife from so far away?" Xavier smiled reassuringly. "The Andersons' daughter married a man from New York City last year, and the Millers themselves came from Norway. Around here, where you're from, matters less than who you are now." The following afternoon, Francesca spent extra time on her appearance, wanting to make a good impression on Xavier's neighbors. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton with white trim, and arranged her hair carefully. When she heard the sound of approaching horses, she smoothed her skirt nervously and joined Xavier on the porch. The Andersons arrived first, John and Margaret, with their youngest son, Peter, who couldn't have been more than 16. They were followed shortly by the Millers, Eric and Sophia, with their daughter Ingrid, who was about Francesca's age. "So you're the English bride," Margaret Anderson said warmly, clasping Francesca's hand between both of hers. "Xavier's been like a son to us since he settled here. We're so pleased he's found someone at last. Though we were starting to think he'd invented you," John added with a good-natured laugh. "He's been going to town every day for 2 weeks, waiting for that stage." Xavier's ears reddened. "I wanted to be there when she arrived." "And a good thing, too," Sophia Miller said, her accent still carrying traces of her Norwegian origins. "Eric heard from the stagecoach driver how ill you were, my dear. Xavier must have been a good nurse." "The best," Francesca confirmed, smiling at Xavier. "I wouldn't have survived without his care." The women insisted on helping Francesca prepare the meal she'd planned, giving them a chance to talk privately in the kitchen while the men gathered on the porch. "How are you finding life here?" Margaret asked as they worked. "It must be quite different from England." "It is," Francesca admitted, "but in the best possible ways. There's a freedom here I never experienced at home, as if life is what you make of it rather than what others decide it should be." Sophia nodded approvingly. "That is why we came too, Eric and I. In the old country we would always be the poor farmer's children. Here we are the Millers of the Singing Creek Ranch." "Xavier speaks very highly of you both," Francesca said. "He says you helped him when he first arrived." "He needed little help," Margaret said. "That man can do anything he sets his mind to, but everyone needs neighbors out here. The winters are too harsh to face alone." "Speaking of winter," Sophia added, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Have you set a date for the wedding? You'll want to be properly settled before the snow flies." Francesca felt her cheeks warm. "The circuit preacher will be through in a little over a week. We're planning to marry then if Xavier hasn't changed his mind." Both women exchanged knowing glances. "Changed his mind?" Margaret repeated incredulously. "My dear, I've never seen Xavier look at anyone the way he looks at you. He may not say much, never has, but his feelings are plain as day to those who know him." "He's been alone a long time," Sophia added. "By choice, mind you. Plenty of local girls would have been happy to catch his eye, but he was waiting for something special." Their words stayed with Francesca throughout the evening as their neighbors shared a meal around the Whittaker table. She found herself watching Xavier as he interacted with these people who had become his surrogate family, noting the quiet confidence with which he carried himself, the respectful way he listened when others spoke, the rare but genuine smile that transformed his face when something amused him. He was, she realized, exactly the man she had imagined from his letters: honorable, hardworking, kind. But he was also more. The gentle hands that had cooled her fever, the strong arms that had lifted her when she couldn't stand, the patient teacher who was showing her a new way of life. After their guests departed, promising to return for the wedding, Francesca and Xavier stood together on the porch in the gathering twilight. "Your neighbors are wonderful," she said. "I'm glad to know you haven't been entirely alone out here." Xavier nodded. "They're good people. Made me feel welcome from the start." He hesitated, then asked, "And you, do you think you could be happy here among us?" Francesca turned to face him fully. "I already am happy, Xavier, happier than I've been in a very long time." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. Slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, he reached out to touch her cheek. His fingers were calloused but gentle against her skin, and Francesca found herself leaning into his touch. "I never expected." Xavier began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "When I wrote that advertisement, I hoped for a companion, someone practical who wouldn't mind the hardships of ranch life. I never imagined I might find someone who feels like coming home." Francesca's heart swelled at the echo of her own words about the fiddle tune. "The Wanderer's Return," she whispered. Xavier nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "May I kiss you, Francesca?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. In answer, she rose on tiptoe, closing the distance between them. His lips were warm against hers, the kiss tentative at first, then deepening as her hands found their way to his shoulders. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and for the first time since her illness, Francesca felt truly alive, not just surviving, but living fully in the moment. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I'm glad you came," he murmured, echoing his words from days earlier but with a new depth of meaning. Francesca smiled, her heart too full for words. Together they stood in the gathering darkness, watching as the first stars appeared in the vast Dakota sky. The days leading up to the preacher's arrival passed in a flurry of activity. Francesca, now almost fully recovered from her illness, threw herself into preparing for both the wedding and her new life as Xavier's wife. She mended and altered her few dresses, planted late summer vegetables in the garden, and practiced her riding daily, gradually venturing farther from the ranch house under Xavier's watchful eye. Xavier, meanwhile, worked from dawn till dusk, determined to have the ranch in perfect order before their marriage. He repaired fences, reinforced the barn roof against the coming winter, and constructed a new dresser for the master bedroom, now to be their shared bedroom. They settled into a comfortable rhythm together, working side by side when possible, sharing meals and conversation, learning the small details of each other's habits and preferences. Francesca discovered that Xavier preferred his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in it, that he unconsciously hummed while he worked with his hands, that he read Shakespeare late into the night when sleep eluded him. Xavier learned that Francesca sang softly to herself while cooking, that she had a keen eye for practical improvements to the cabin's arrangement, that she was fascinated by the native wildflowers and collected samples to press between the pages of a journal. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Xavier taught Francesca about the constellations visible in the Dakota sky. Sometimes he would bring out his fiddle, playing the old songs his father had taught him while Francesca listened, occasionally joining in when she knew the words. It was during one such evening, 3 days before the preacher's expected arrival, that Xavier broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about our wedding," he said, setting aside his fiddle. Francesca's heart skipped a beat. "Yes. I know it won't be the kind of ceremony you might have had in England. Just a simple service with the neighbors as witnesses, no fancy church or reception." She smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "Xavier, I'm not marrying you for a grand ceremony. I'm marrying you for the life we'll build together afterward." He squeezed her hand gently. "Even so, I want it to be special for you. I've asked Margaret and Sophia to help with the preparations. They're bringing food, and Sophia's daughter Ingrid has offered to lend you her wedding veil." Tears pricked at Francesca's eyes, touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's lovely, thank you." Xavier looked out over the darkening prairie, his expression contemplative. "There's something else I've been meaning to ask you about after the wedding." Francesca felt her cheeks warm, guessing his meaning. Despite the growing affection between them, the kisses they now shared regularly, the lingering touches, the way Xavier sometimes looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice they had not discussed the physical aspect of their impending marriage. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't continue. Xavier cleared his throat. "I was thinking we might take a few days, just the two of us, after the ceremony. Not a proper honeymoon, can't leave the ranch for that long, but maybe a trip to the lake about a day's ride from here. There's a small cabin there that belongs to John Anderson. He's offered it to us for as long as we'd like." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Francesca's chest. "That sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "I'd like that very much." Xavier nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. "Good, that's good." He stood abruptly. "It's getting late. We should turn in." As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, Francesca found herself thinking about the coming changes in their relationship. In just 3 days, she would no longer be Francesca Thornton, mail-order bride, but Francesca Whittaker, wife. The thought sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a deeper sense of rightness, of belonging. The day before the preacher's arrival, Xavier announced that he needed to make a final trip into Evanston for supplies. "I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours," he assured Francesca. "Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," she said, smiling at his concern. "I have plenty to keep me occupied. Mrs. Anderson is coming by later to help me put the finishing touches on my wedding dress." Xavier nodded, seeming oddly nervous. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised, kissing her briefly before mounting his horse. True to her word, Margaret Anderson arrived midday, bringing with her a box of sewing notions and Sophia Miller's skilled hands. Together, the 3 women worked on Francesca's dress, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue cotton with white lace trim that Margaret had helped her design. "You'll make a beautiful bride," Sophia declared as Francesca tried on the nearly completed dress. "Xavier won't be able to take his eyes off you." "I hope so," Francesca said, smoothing the fabric self-consciously. "I want everything to be perfect for him. He's done so much for me." Margaret gave her a knowing look. "Marriage isn't about perfection, my dear. It's about facing life's imperfections together." She adjusted the lace at Francesca's collar. "John and I have been married 32 years. We've weathered droughts and blizzards, lost crops and children, faced hardships I couldn't have imagined as a bride. But we faced them side by side, and that made all the difference." "Xavier is a good man," Sophia added. "Strong, yes, but gentle too. He will make a fine husband." Francesca nodded, thinking of Xavier's patient care during her illness, his quiet strength, his unexpected tenderness. "I know," she said softly. "I'm very fortunate." The women were just finishing their work when they heard the sound of an approaching horse. "That must be Xavier," Francesca said, hurriedly changing out of the wedding dress. "He's back earlier than I expected." But when she stepped onto the porch, it wasn't Xavier she saw riding up to the cabin, but a stranger, a thin man with a weathered face and clerical collar. "Afternoon, ladies," he called, dismounting stiffly. "I'm Reverend Thomas Benson. I understand there's to be a wedding here tomorrow." Margaret stepped forward to greet him. "Reverend, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Made better time than I thought," the preacher explained. "Weather's holding fair, and the river crossing was easier than usual this time of year." He turned to Francesca with a kind smile. "You must be the bride. Xavier's written quite glowingly about you in his letters to the parish committee." Francesca blushed, surprised and pleased to hear that Xavier had been writing about her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Reverend." "Xavier's gone to town for supplies, but he should return shortly. Please, come in and rest from your journey." The Reverend accepted her invitation gratefully, and soon he was seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a slice of Francesca's freshly baked bread. Margaret and Sophia excused themselves, promising to return the following day for the ceremony, leaving Francesca alone with the preacher. "So, my dear," Reverend Benson said once they were settled, "how are you finding life in the Dakota Territory? Quite different from England, I imagine." "Very different," Francesca agreed, "but in wonderful ways. The land here has a beauty all its own." "And your health? Xavier mentioned in his letter that you arrived quite ill." Francesca nodded, remembering those first desperate days. "I contracted some fever during the journey. If not for Xavier's care, I might not have survived." The Reverend studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "It seems God brought you two together at precisely the right moment." "I believe he did," Francesca said softly. They chatted amiably as the afternoon wore on, with Reverend Benson sharing stories of his circuit ministry and Francesca telling him about her journey from England. She found him to be a thoughtful listener and a kind-hearted man, easy to talk to despite their brief acquaintance. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Francesca started to worry about Xavier's prolonged absence. "He should have been back by now," she said, peering out the window for any sign of his approach. "Likely got held up in town," the Reverend reassured her. "Happens to the best of us. Roads are good, so I'm sure he's fine." Just as Francesca was considering saddling Daisy to go looking for him, she heard the welcome sound of hoofbeats approaching. She hurried to the porch, relief washing over her at the sight of Xavier riding toward the cabin. The relief turned to concern, however, when she noticed how slowly he was moving, his posture uncharacteristically slumped in the saddle. "Xavier," she called, hurrying down the steps to meet him. "Is everything all right?" He dismounted carefully, wincing as his feet touched the ground. Only then did Francesca notice the darkening bruise on his left cheekbone and the bloodied knuckles of his right hand. "What happened?" she gasped, reaching for him. Xavier attempted a reassuring smile that turned into a grimace. "Just a small disagreement in town. Nothing to worry about." "You're hurt," Francesca protested, gently touching the bruise on his face. "Looks worse than it is," he insisted, then noticed the Reverend standing on the porch. "Reverend Benson, you're early." "And you're late and injured," the preacher observed, coming down to help Francesca support Xavier into the cabin. "What kind of disagreement leaves a man in this state the day before his wedding?" Xavier sighed as they lowered him into a chair. Some men from the mining camps were in town, getting rowdy at the saloon. They were, making comments about Francesca that I couldn't let pass. Francesca's eyes widened. "About me? But they don't even know me." Xavier looked away, his jaw tightening. They'd heard about the English mail-order bride and were making inappropriate speculations, suggesting that any woman who'd travel so far to marry a stranger must be. He trailed off, unwilling to repeat their crude insinuations. "So you fought them," Reverend Benson concluded, shaking his head. "How many were there?" "3," Xavier admitted, though only 2 were still standing by the end of it. Despite her concern, Francesca felt a rush of warmth at Xavier's defense of her honor. "You shouldn't have risked yourself for my sake," she said, retrieving a basin of water and clean cloths to tend his injuries. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat," Xavier said firmly, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Reverend Benson cleared his throat. "Well, I can't condone violence, but I understand defending a lady's honor. Still, it might be wise to postpone the ceremony for a day or two, until you're more presentable." "No," Xavier and Francesca said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise. "I mean," Xavier continued, "unless Francesca wants to wait, I'd prefer to keep to our plans." "I don't want to wait," Francesca confirmed, gently cleaning the cut on Xavier's knuckles. "A few bruises won't change how I feel." The Reverend smiled, looking between them with obvious approval. "Very well. Tomorrow it is, then. Now, if you don't mind, I think I'll retire early. It's been a long journey." Once the Reverend had been shown to the spare room that would soon be Francesca's old bedroom, Xavier and Francesca sat together at the kitchen table while she finished tending his injuries. "I'm sorry about this," Xavier said, gesturing to his bruised face. "Not exactly how I planned to look on our wedding day." Francesca shook her head, applying a soothing salve to his cheekbone. "I'm just glad you weren't more seriously hurt. 3 against 1 isn't fair odds." "I've had worse," he said with a slight shrug, then winced at the movement. "Actually, that's not true. This is probably the worst beating I've taken since I was 16 and tried to ride my father's meanest stallion." Francesca couldn't help but laugh at his rueful expression. "My brave, foolish cowboy," she said fondly, the endearment slipping out naturally. Xavier caught her hand, pressing it to his uninjured cheek. "I couldn't stand hearing them talk about you that way. You're the most courageous, honorable woman I've ever known, Francesca. Traveling so far, facing so much, all on your own." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "It was worth it," she whispered. "Every mile, every hardship, to be here with you. It's worth everything." Xavier stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. "Tomorrow you'll be my wife," he said softly, his lips brushing her temple. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice." Francesca lifted her face to his, mindful of his bruises as she kissed him softly. "I could never regret choosing you, Xavier Whittaker. Never." They stood together in the quiet kitchen, the prairie night settling around the cabin like a blanket, holding each other with the sweet anticipation of tomorrow's promises. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if the Dakota skies themselves were blessing the union. Francesca awoke early, too excited and nervous to sleep, and slipped outside to watch the sunrise from the porch. The eastern horizon was just beginning to glow with pink and gold when she heard the cabin door open behind her. "Couldn't sleep either," Xavier asked, joining her at the porch railing. Francesca shook her head, smiling up at him. His face looked worse in the morning light, the bruise having darkened to a vivid purple, but his eyes were clear and filled with a happiness that made her heart swell. Too many thoughts spinning in my head. Second thoughts? He asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. No, she said firmly, taking his hand. Never that, just amazement that we're here together after everything. Xavier nodded, understanding in his expression. 6 months ago, you were a name on a letter. Now you're about to become my wife. Life has a way of surprising us. The best kind of surprise, Francesca murmured, leaning against his side as the sun crested the horizon, bathing the prairie in golden light. They stayed that way until the sounds of movement from inside the cabin reminded them of the day's preparations. With a last squeeze of her hand, Xavier headed to the barn to tend to the morning chores, while Francesca returned inside to begin breakfast for their guest. By mid-morning, the neighbors began to arrive. The Andersons brought tables and chairs to set up in the yard, while the Millers arrived with flowers gathered from the prairie and food for the celebration. Sophia and Ingrid immediately whisked Francesca upstairs to help her prepare, leaving the men to set up for the ceremony outside. "You look beautiful," Ingrid declared when Francesca was finally dressed, her chestnut hair arranged in soft curls under the borrowed veil. "Xavier won't know what hit him." Sophia nodded approvingly, adjusting the lace at Francesca's throat. "A perfect bride, and just look at this." She led Francesca to the window, where she could see the yard below. Xavier and the other men had transformed the space. Wooden benches had been arranged in rows facing a simple arch that Xavier must have built in secret, now decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. A path of scattered petals led from the porch to the arch, where Reverend Benson stood ready. "It's beautiful," Francesca whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "Xavier has been working on the arch for weeks," Margaret revealed. "He kept it hidden in the barn, wanting it to be a surprise for you." Francesca pressed a hand to her heart, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I didn't know." "That man would lasso the moon for you if he could," Sophia said with a knowing smile. "Now, are you ready to become Mrs. Whittaker?" At Francesca's nod, Margaret went downstairs to signal that the bride was ready. The small gathering of neighbors took their seats, and John Anderson positioned himself at the bottom of the porch steps, ready to escort Francesca in the absence of her father. When Sophia began playing a hymn on the small organ they'd transported from the Andersons' home, Francesca took a deep breath and descended the stairs. John offered his arm with a warm smile, and together they stepped out into the sunshine. Francesca saw nothing but Xavier as she walked toward him. He stood tall and straight beneath the flower-decked arch, his bruised face transformed by a smile of such wonder and joy that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. He wore his best shirt and a black string tie, his wheat-colored hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving hers as she approached. When she reached him, John placed her hand in Xavier's, the symbolic giving of the bride bringing a moment of poignant remembrance for the family she had lost. But as Xavier's fingers closed gently around hers, Francesca felt not loss but a profound sense of homecoming. This was where she belonged. Reverend Benson's words washed over her as she stood hand in hand with Xavier, promising to love and cherish in sickness and in health, as long as they both shall live. When Xavier repeated the vows, his voice was steady and sure, his eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "With this ring I thee wed," Xavier said, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger, another surprise, as she hadn't known he'd purchased a ring. "And with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you as my wife." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier cupped her face with gentle hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made the gathered neighbors break into spontaneous applause. "Mrs. Whittaker," he whispered against her lips, his voice filled with wonder. "Mr. Whittaker," she answered, her heart too full for more elaborate words. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous. They shared a meal with their neighbors under the open sky, accepting congratulations and well wishes. There was music, Xavier's fiddle joining with Eric Miller's accordion, and Peter Anderson's harmonica and dancing, with Xavier leading Francesca in a waltz he'd secretly practiced with Margaret's help. As the afternoon waned into evening, the guests began to depart, leaving with hugs and promises to visit soon. John Anderson was the last to leave, handing Xavier a set of keys to the lake cabin with a knowing wink. "Everything's stocked and ready," he assured them. "Take as long as you need. Peter will check on your cattle every day." When the last wagon disappeared down the road, Xavier and Francesca stood alone in their yard, now returned to its usual state except for the flower-decked arch that stood as a reminder of their vows. "Did you really build that weeks ago?" Francesca asked, nodding toward the arch. Xavier nodded, a hint of shyness in his smile. "I wanted something special for you, something that would make it feel like a real wedding, not just a hasty frontier arrangement." "It was perfect," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Everything was perfect." "Not quite everything," Xavier said ruefully, touching his bruised face. "Not exactly how I planned to look in our wedding memories." Francesca laughed, taking his hand and leading him toward the porch. "I think it suits you, actually. My brave, protective husband, defending my honor before we even said our vows." "Well, when you put it that way," Xavier said with a grin, following her inside their home, now truly theirs together. They left for the lake cabin early the next morning, riding side by side through the rolling prairie. Xavier had packed supplies in saddlebags, promising Francesca that everything else they might need was already at the cabin. The journey took most of the day, with stops to rest the horses and share a simple lunch beside a bubbling creek. As they rode, Xavier pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days in the territory. Francesca listened, enchanted both by the tales and by the animated way he told them, so different from his usual reserved manner. Marriage, it seemed, had already begun to reveal new facets of the man she'd wed. The sun was low in the western sky when they crested a hill and saw the lake below them, its surface glittering like hammered silver in the late afternoon light. On its near shore stood a small cabin, rustic but sound, with a porch facing the water. "It's beautiful," Francesca breathed as they approached. "So peaceful." Xavier helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "The Andersons only use it for fishing trips now that their children are grown. John said we're welcome to stay as long as we like." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a wooden table with chairs. A door at the back led to a bedroom with a large bed covered in handmade quilts. Everything was spotlessly clean, and Francesca spotted a vase of fresh wildflowers on the table. Sophia's touch, no doubt. While Xavier tended to the horses, Francesca explored their temporary home, finding the cupboard stocked with food, the woodpile full, and even a bottle of wine with 2 glasses set out on the table, another thoughtful gesture from their neighbors. By the time Xavier returned, she had a fire going in the fireplace and was heating water for coffee. He paused in the doorway, watching her move around the small space with a look of quiet wonder on his face. "What is it?" she asked when she noticed his gaze. "Just thinking how right you look here," he said simply. "How right this feels. Francesca crossed to him, sliding her arms around his waist. "It does feel right, doesn't it?" Xavier's hands came up to frame her face, his expression suddenly serious. "Francesca, I need to tell you something." A flutter of nerves stirred in her stomach. "Yes. When you first arrived, so ill that I feared you might die, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if you recovered, I would be honest with you about something I hadn't fully expressed in my letters." Francesca held her breath, uncertain what revelation was coming. "I told you I was seeking a companion, a practical arrangement between two people looking for security and family," Xavier continued, his blue eyes intent on hers. "That was true at first. But as we corresponded, as I came to know your mind through your words, it became more than that for me." He drew a deep breath. "I was already falling in love with you before you arrived, Francesca. Nursing you through that fever, watching your courage and determination during your recovery, only deepened those feelings. I didn't say it yesterday in our vows because I wanted to tell you privately, without an audience. But I love you. Not just as my wife, not just as my partner in this life we're building, but with my whole heart." Tears spilled down Francesca's cheeks at his words. "Oh, Xavier, I love you too." I think I began falling in love with the man in those letters, so thoughtful, so honest, so different from any man I'd known. But the real you, the man who stayed by my side for 3 days and nights, who taught me to ride and play chess and see the beauty in this wild land. That man I love beyond measure." Xavier's kiss was different from the ones they'd shared before, deeper, less restrained, filled with the love they'd just declared. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he confessed. "When I wrote that advertisement, I hoped for companionship, maybe affection in time. I never dreamed I would find someone who would make me feel this way." "What way?" Francesca asked softly, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Complete," he said simply. "As if all my life I've been waiting for you without even knowing it." They stood together in the firelight, the first evening of their marriage stretching before them with the promise of all the days and years to come. The week at the lake cabin passed in a sweet haze of discovery. They swam in the clear waters, fished for their supper, took long rides exploring the surrounding hills, and spent evenings by the fire, talking and planning their future. And at night, they learned the intimate language of marriage, Xavier's patience and tenderness making Francesca feel both cherished and desired. On their last evening before returning to the ranch, they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Francesca leaned against Xavier's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist. "I wish we could stay longer," she said with a contented sigh. Xavier kissed the top of her head. "We can come back whenever you like, but I have to admit, I'm eager to return home and start our life together properly." "Me too," Francesca agreed. "There's so much I want to do: expand the garden, help with the orchard planning, maybe even learn to make cheese like Sophia showed me." Xavier chuckled, his chest rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "Already making plans to improve my bachelor ways, Mrs. Whittaker." "Our ways now," she corrected with a smile. "Our home, our ranch, our future." "Our future," Xavier repeated thoughtfully. "What do you see when you think about that?" Francesca considered the question seriously. "I see the orchard you've always wanted, the trees growing taller each year. I see the garden expanded, maybe with a greenhouse someday for growing vegetables even in winter. I see more cattle, maybe some sheep too." She paused, then added softly, "And I see children, Xavier. Our children running across the prairie, riding their ponies, learning from their father how to build and grow things." Xavier's arm tightened around her. How many children do you see in this future of ours? As many as God blesses us with, she answered honestly. I grew up an only child until Thomas was born when I was 12. I always wished for a larger family. I had 3 brothers, Xavier said. Never a dull moment, never a quiet one either, but there was always someone to help with chores, someone to talk to late at night. Then we're agreed, Francesca said, turning to face him with a smile. A house full of Whittakers. Xavier cupped her face in his hands, his expression tender. Nothing would make me happier than building that future with you, Francesca. Nothing at all. 10 years later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the Whittaker ranch as Xavier rode toward home, his day's work completed earlier than usual. The ranch had prospered over the past decade, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the territory. They now employed 3 full-time hands and maintained a herd of over 500 cattle, along with a small flock of sheep that had been Francesca's project. As he crested the final hill, Xavier paused to admire the view that never failed to fill him with pride. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper 2-story home, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. A barn twice the size of the original stood nearby, along with several outbuildings. The garden Francesca had begun their first year together now covered nearly an acre, providing vegetables for their table year-round thanks to the greenhouse he'd built for their 5th anniversary. And there, on the western slope, stood the orchard 50 apple and cherry trees, now bearing fruit each year. Some of the trees were tall enough that their 8-year-old son, James, could climb them, much to his mother's concern and his father's carefully hidden amusement. Movement near the house caught Xavier's eye, and he smiled as he saw Francesca emerge onto the porch. Their youngest child, 2-year-old Sarah, balanced on her hip. Even after 10 years of marriage and 4 children, the sight of his wife still made Xavier's heart beat faster. Her chestnut hair now had a few strands of silver at the temples, and childbearing had softened the slender figure he'd first known, but to Xavier, she grew more beautiful with each passing year. As he rode closer, he could see 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old William playing some game in the yard under their mother's watchful eye. James was likely still at his lessons. Francesca insisted on a proper education for all their children, teaching them herself with books ordered from back east. Francesca spotted him and waved, saying something to the children that made them look up and run toward him, shouting excitedly. Xavier dismounted to meet them, catching William as the boy launched himself into his father's arms. "Papa, you're home early," Emma exclaimed, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Finished moving the herd to the south pasture faster than I expected," Xavier explained, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Thought I'd surprise everyone." "Did you bring us anything?" William asked hopefully, peering at his father's saddlebags. Xavier laughed. "Not today, son. But I did see a family of deer that reminded me of that story Mama's been reading to you." By this time, Francesca had joined them, Sarah reaching out pudgy arms toward her father. Xavier took his youngest daughter, pressing a kiss to her downy head before leaning over to kiss his wife properly. "Welcome home," Francesca said, her sage green eyes as bright and captivating as the day they'd met. "You are early. Everything all right at the south pasture?" "Perfect," Xavier confirmed. "The new grass is coming in well there. Should last the herd until the first snow." He glanced around. "Where's James?" "Finishing his mathematics," Francesca said with a small smile. "He was quite determined to solve all the problems before dinner." Xavier nodded, pride warming his chest. Their firstborn had his mother's quick mind and love of learning, combined with Xavier's determination. "And how are you feeling today?" he asked Francesca, his gaze dropping briefly to the gentle swell of her abdomen just beginning to show beneath her apron. "Better than yesterday," she assured him. "The morning sickness seems to be easing finally." This fifth pregnancy had been harder on Francesca than the previous ones, with severe morning sickness that had lasted well into the afternoon for the first 3 months. Xavier had been concerned enough to suggest they ride to Evanston to see the doctor, but Francesca had insisted it was just the nature of this particular baby. "Mama says the new baby is going to be a boy," Emma announced confidently. "I want a sister, but William and James want another brother." "Is that right?" Xavier asked, amused by his daughter's certainty. "And how does Mama know that? Because this one kicks like James did," Francesca explained, patting her belly. "Like a little cowboy already." The family made their way toward the house, the children chattering about their day's activities while Xavier and Francesca exchanged the comfortable, knowing glances of a couple whose love had deepened with each shared year. Later that evening, with the children finally asleep after much negotiation and several bedtime stories, Xavier and Francesca sat together on the porch, enjoying the peaceful end to the day. The prairie stretched before them, bathed in moonlight, the same view they'd shared countless evenings over their years together. "I received a letter from my friend Charlotte in England today," Francesca mentioned, her head resting comfortably against Xavier's shoulder. "She's finally going to visit us next spring, after all these years of promising to." "That's wonderful," Xavier said, genuinely pleased for his wife. Though Francesca had embraced her life in Dakota with wholehearted enthusiasm, he knew she sometimes missed the friends of her youth. "She can meet the new baby then." Francesca nodded, her hand moving to rest on her growing belly. "I can hardly believe we'll have 5 children. Sometimes I think back to when I first arrived, so ill I could barely stand, and it seems like another lifetime." "Those 3 days you were burning with fever were the longest of my life," Xavier admitted, covering her hand with his own. "I was so afraid I would lose you before I'd even had a chance to know you." "But you saved me," Francesca said softly, turning to look at him. "Not just from the fever, but from a life of loneliness. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Xavier, a home, a family, a love I never thought I'd find." Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling as he often did at the twists of fate that had brought them together. "You know, when I sent that advertisement to the matrimonial agency, the neighbors thought I was crazy. Why bring a woman from halfway around the world when there are plenty of eligible girls right here in the territory?" they asked. "And what did you tell them?" Francesca asked, though she'd heard this story before. "I said I wasn't looking for just any wife. I was looking for the right one, no matter where she might be." Xavier pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Little did I know how right you would be, or how close I would come to losing you before we'd even begun." "But you didn't lose me," Francesca reminded him, snuggling closer into his embrace as the evening chill began to settle. "And you never will." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast Dakota sky, testament to the enduring promise they'd made to each other a decade earlier. From the sick where he'd nursed her back to health, to the home they'd built together, to the family that filled that home with love and laughter, their journey had been one of courage, commitment, and a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. And as the prairie wind whispered around them like a benediction, Xavier and Francesca Whitaker held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought a mail-order bride and a lonely rancher together, and for the love that had transformed them both.